Greetings, listeners, and welcome back to the podcast of Jewish Ideas, a Torah in Motion podcast. I am your host, JJ Kimchi. Perhaps the single greatest achievement in the field of Jewish studies so far this century has been Alter's translation and commentary of the Hebrew Bible. A mammoth 3-volume work published in 2018, it is roundly recognized as one of the best biblical translations available and has become a new standard work in the field. It is perhaps made more extraordinary by the fact that, unlike most biblical translations, this work was the labor of a single individual, Dr. Robert Alter, professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California, Berkeley. His extraordinary output includes many individual translations of biblical books, various monographs on literature, and innumerable essays published in journals worldwide. Yet it is not only his translations and commentary that has secured Professor Alter's reputation within the community of Bible readers. He is also a pioneer in what has been termed the literary approach to reading the Bible, which has gained many adherents within both academic and religious circles. We are truly honored to have Professor Robert Alter join us here at the podcast of Jewish Ideas in order to discuss his methods for both reading and translating biblical texts. Professor, welcome to the podcast of Jewish Ideas.
Happy to be here.
Thank you very much. So we'll dedicate the first half of today's conversation to what has generally been termed the literary reading or literary approach to reading the Bible, in which you are seen and your work is seen as one of the pioneers. Could you perhaps characterize this approach for us? Tell us what are its central qualities?
Yeah, well, see, there's a peculiar thing about the Hebrew Bible, which is ancient Israel was a modest sliver of a country sandwiched in between great empires, and its material culture, as archaeology has revealed, compared to the Assyria, Egypt, and so forth, was rather rudimentary. But for a reason we will never know, it produced literary geniuses, narratives that eclipsed everything all around them, and great poetry. And so my starting point in dealing with the literary aspects of the Bible is that these writers, however they may have been impelled by a monotheistic vision of reality, chose to cast that vision in finely wrought narrative prose and brilliant poetry. And that if you want to see what they're really saying in fine detail, you have to attend to the literary articulation of the text. I would add this. Somehow or other, I think I know the somehow or other, we have suffered from a kind of cultural amnesia about the literary formation of the Bible. And that's what I set out to do my part in correcting all those years ago when I wrote books on biblical narrative and biblical poetry. That is, both Jews and Christians through the centuries have viewed the Bible primarily as a source of revelation. There you go to find what God demands of humankind and what his plans for humankind are. And if you want moral instruction, you can go to the Bible. Now, with that orientation, we came to forget the subtle and highly sophisticated techniques and conventions that were summoned up by the biblical writers to get their vision across. And so what I tried to do is a kind of act of literary archaeology to dig back in the text, dig through the layers of religious and theological reading and see how the texts were formed as literature.
Fascinating. So let's say you open up the book of Genesis, you're presented with various stories, or the book of Exodus, or whichever book you choose. And what are the sorts of things you're looking for? What are the sorts of things you're noticing? How does a literary analysis look when it comes to the Hebrew Bible?
Okay, let me take one feature, which is repetition.
Okay.
Now, we're all taught in middle school not to repeat yourself when you're writing your class essay. And I'm afraid that that has infected the approach of the 20th century translators of the Bible. They avoid repetition. If a phrase is repeated, they will vary it. And this is a catastrophic error because repetition is a subtle literary technique in the Bible. Of course, there's, to begin with, the repetition of thematic terms, something that Buber and Rosenzweig back in the 1920s detected and called Leitwörter, that is leading or thematic keywords. So you have to preserve those, but also you have this subtle technique of repetition that is not quite repetition, although it might seem to be if you read casually. That is, there are many instances in biblical narrative where the narrator says something, say a full sentence, and then repeats it, and then one of the characters repeats that same sentence. So what's going on? Well, there's repetition, but there are little swerves away from the verbatim. And those are apertures of meaning. I'll give one very simple example. When Potiphar's wife, after her failed sexual assault on Joseph, accuses him of rape, she first turns to the people of the household, and she says of her husband, look, he has brought us a Hebrew man to dally with us, or to mock us. It means both things. Ru hevi lanu ish ivri letzachek banu. Okay. Then she repeats exactly the same words to her husband when he comes home, with one little change. She says, Ru'u ha'eved ha'ivri she'eveta lanu, the Hebrew slave whom you wrote. So why is that? Well, when she's speaking, and this is a small instance, but I think it's paradigmatic of the way repetition with variation works. When she's speaking to the people in the household, she's speaking to people who are probably slaves.
Right.
And she doesn't want to push a button which will make them think of their solidarity as slaves with Joseph. So instead, she calls him a Hebrew man, Ish Ivri. In that case, activating their sense of ethnic solidarity against those wild Semites from the north who come down here to violate our women. When she addresses the same words to her husband, she switches from man to slave because she wants to remind her husband of the chutzpah of a mere slave, a person who's his property, daring to assault her. So it's a tiny difference, but it's a significant difference, and you find that all over the place in Hebrew narrative.
This is fascinating to me, Professor, because as a student, and as many Jews are, of the classic commentators, Rashi, Ramban, Ibn Ezra, people like that, it seems that at least what you're describing is at least has some overlap with the sorts of things they were noticing. In other words, they also paid attention to minute differences in wording and try to come up with explanations for it. I assume you see yourself at least partially in their, operating in their framework, but also as different from them. How do you see yourself? How's your approach differ qualitatively from theirs?
Yeah, I'm a great admirer of, especially of Ibn Ezra.
I noticed in
Yeah,
your translation, Ibn Ezra is invoked fairly frequently.
right. Now, I would say this, because the medieval Hebrew commentators assume that there was never a single wasted word in the Bible. It was a real text. They paid attention to these minute word choices, and that's similar to what I do. Also, in the case of Ibn Ezra, at times I find that he has a certain literary bent in his translation, because among the many things he did, he was a kind of polymath. He was a Hebrew poet, and a pretty good Hebrew poet. Okay, I will stop to cite one of my favorite comments by Ibn Ezra.
Please.
When Mount Sinai, which is also called, as I'm sure you know, Har Chorev, appears, he says, he parses the word Chorev quite correctly, I think. He says that it's because it's a very dry place. That is, it relates to that Hebrew word. So, Har Chorev means something like parched mountain. He got that. And then he adds just a few words, 3 or 4 words. He says, "V'hu mahalach shlosha yamim minilus shel Mitzrayim," and it's a 3-day walk from Egypt's Nile. And I asked him, so what's he communicating? Why does he say that? And then it hit me. What, in a very compressed form, what he's getting across is that space, as we would say in our literary jargon, is thematic. That is, Moses grew up in Egypt by the Nile. He was floating in that little basket in the Nile. So he's a water baby. And Egypt has lots of water because of the Nile. When he encounters God for the first time on Mount Horeb, he's in an antithetical space. It's dry, and God will be revealed not in water but in fire. So I think that's a brilliant insight on the part of Ibn Ezra.
And you think that's what he was saying when he said it's a 3-day walk?
Yeah, I think so. Otherwise, why would he toss in Nile in his comment?
That's a fascinating insight. I'll have to go back and read that Ibn Ezra. I mean, I share your admiration for Ibn Ezra. I think the dimensions of his insight were, I think, unparalleled in many ways among biblical commentators.
But I see that I didn't answer your question of how my approach differs.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's fair enough.
And here, the first thing I wrote on the Bible was an analysis of the story of Judah and Tamar, which then became a chapter in my book on biblical narrative. At first, I had no idea I was going to write a book on that subject. I pointed out that there was a whole network of connections between the story, which biblical scholars used to say was an interpolation, the surrounding narrative material in Genesis. That is, Judah is deceived by a garment. That is his daughter-in-law Tamar, who dresses up as a roadside prostitute. just as he and his brothers deceived their father with a garment. And what he offers to pay Tamar for her sexual services is goats.
Right.
And it's goat's blood in which the many-colored or whatever it is tunic, ornamental tunic,
Tonet pasim, yes.
In which it's soaked. So, and there are other connections. Now I proudly thought I discovered these links, and then after the article appeared, I looked in Bereshit Rabbah.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered that the authors of Recasting the Bible had seen the same thing, but the difference is that and I don't remember specifically the wording of the comment in Recasting the Bible, but it's very didactic. And even though they see the same connection that I saw. My approach is definitely not didactic.
Right. You're not seeking to, say, impart religious lessons. You're seeking to
Right.
arrive at a literary analysis of the text. Now, this is very interesting what you say, because I will give over a sort of sociological observation that I have experienced in my life, which is that in the yeshivot that I have studied in, also in many, I would say, modern Orthodox circles in the United States and in Israel, this literary approach to the Bible has been enthusiastically adopted, and of course given a religious literary tinge. But really, I mean, if you look at many of the Bible works coming out of, let's say, a place like Yeshiva University or my alma mater in Israel, Yeshivat Har Etzion, many of them are building sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly on the sorts of approaches and techniques that you suggested, several decades back. So, firstly, I mean, I don't know if you know about this, what you make of it, and I think it's extraordinary that your work, which does not seem to be at all religious in orientation, is adopted by, let's say, religious teachers of the Tanakh, precisely because a literary approach sidesteps the need to ascribe authorship. In other words, it doesn't focus on who wrote these texts, which is obviously a bone of contention or difficulty for some Orthodox teachers, but rather it just allows an analysis of the text itself and a mining of the text for its, let's say, literary riches, and which, of course, then can be used to point towards, let's say, theological religious lessons. So I just want to ask you, are you aware of this development? Did you foresee it? Have you been initiated into it? What is your relationship with it?
Yes, I've been vaguely aware of it. I mean, a long time ago, over 20 years ago, I spent a visiting year at Princeton. They have these eating houses, and there's one that's a kosher eating house. They asked me during the year that I was there to be, faculty sponsor or something. So my wife and I and our young son who was with us that year would have dinner once a week, and the young people were very nice. Mm-hmm. They were, given the fact that it was kosher food, they were mostly Orthodox,
right?
And one young woman who had studied in Israel in a yeshiva, which was open to women, said that was well before I did any translation, but the two books on narrative and poetry were out, and she said, our teacher in the yeshiva, the Rav so and so, strongly recommends your work to us. So that's interesting. Now, let me say something, if I can look across to the reception of the translation.
Sure.
Which did surprise me a little bit. I did the translation without a particular community of faith in mind. or indeed without communities of faith in mind. I was focusing, well, I guess on two things. Well, one was to try to do justice to the literary crafting of the Hebrew text, but also to try to get back, and we could talk about this later, to what I could make out to be the original sense of certain important Hebrew terms, which had been obfuscated, I think, by all kinds of translations. And when the translation came out, I got, it's now quieted down, but I got an outpouring of emails. And I would say most of them were from believers of various sorts, not just Jewish believers. I mean, they're modern Orthodox, including one precious email I got from a 14-year-old girl at a Jewish day school, which really touched me. But then I got emails from Presbyterian organists and Baptist ministers, one from an Episcopalian nun. I hadn't even realized that the Episcopalians had nuns, and a Scottish minister, and so on and so forth.
A truly ecumenical inbox.
Yeah, right.
At the time, yes.
So it dawned on me that the kind of thing that I was doing with the Bible spoke to believers because they felt it brought them closer to what was really going on in the Bible.
100%. And I would say more than that, Professor, which is that, in my experience, a literary reading of the Bible, especially when you compare literary elements from different books, it does give the sense of both an underlying unity of the Tanakh in certain ways, but also a beauty and a depth and a richness that perhaps one wouldn't have seen on first glance without, let's say, an able guide, let's say, of you or any of those who read the Bible in your vein. And therefore, again, I think it seems to be conducive to religious faith in the sense that deepens one's appreciation for let's say, the wisdom or brilliance of the Bible, which, when married to a theological basis of this is, say, a divine or divinely inspired text, that advances that kind of worldview quite considerably.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That's quite something. I want to ask you a bit more about the literary reading, but before we move on, I have to say that I had an interesting experience in Israel of using your Bible translation, specifically the 5 books of Moses translation, in a more academic setting. My alma mater, my undergraduate, is a Shalem College, a small liberal arts institution in Israel, and one of the classes was taught there by a professor from the United States called Leon Kass, who I'm sure you're familiar with.
I've read a few of his things.
Right, exactly. He is interesting. He's a big fan of yours, and you likes to use your works. But amusingly enough, the class was given by Leon Kass to a group of Israelis. I mean, I happened to be in the class, but it was an Israeli college, and so he did not feel comfortable enough teaching the text in Hebrew, so he used your translation. So you had a room full of Israelis reading the Tanakh, not in their native Hebrew, but rather through the Alta translation, and discussing the nuances of the text through your translation, your commentary. It was an amusing sort of inversion of what might have been the case. Anyway, I thought you might enjoy hearing that.
Interesting.
Excellent. Another element of your literary approach I don't think I saw elsewhere was something that you call the type scene. And I'm going to try and summarize. The type scene seems to be a sort of repetitive scene or a specific, let's say, literary template, which appears in a few different places in the Bible, and in which characters from different stories undergo similar experiences. And the Bible uses this as a repetitive technique. Can you elaborate? What is the text attempting to do by repeating, let's say, a similar literary template in different areas?
Well, you see, the type scene, it's a label that I borrowed from Homer scholarship, is it illustrates what I was talking about on the microscopic level of single words, where you have repetition and then a little swerve, but the little swerve is almost always significant. This is more on the macro level
Right.
of a plot, where you have the same story being told. Let's say a young man, or in one case his surrogate, on foreign territory, meets a young woman at a well and is smitten with her, and she rushes home. These are all repeated elements. She rushes home to bring news of the arrival of the young man, and then in almost all the stories, a feast is laid out, and at the feast, betrothal conditions are discussed, and she becomes his bride.
So if my memory serves me correctly, that includes the story of Eliezer going to get Rivka. That includes Yaakov and Rachel and Moshe and the daughters of Yitro. Is this correct?
Right.
Right. Okay, fine. Good.
And then there are variations, like it looks to me like Ruth and Boaz is a kind of gender reversed allusion to the what I call the betrothal type scene. Now, what's interesting, when I first pondered this all those years ago, was that I discovered that Bible scholars were saying, well, it's a repetition because of oral transmission. First, it gets attached to one set of characters and then to another set of characters. And I thought that can't be right, because the variations in the repetition, that's why it's similar to the variation in verbatim repetition. The variations in the repetition are always significant, always appropriate to the particular characters.
Right.
So in the case of Jacob, you remember he's the only one who has to. There is an unimpeded drawing of water from the well, but he has to wrestle this huge stone single-handed off the mouth of the well.
Right.
Now, first of all, Jacob is a wrestler from birth on. He comes into the world clinging to his twin brother's heel, and then stones are a kind of motif in his story. You know, he sets a stone, I think not as a pillow, but by his head in the Bethel episode. He sets a pile of stones as a marker of the border between him and Lavan, and so forth. So you see that it's a purposeful convention, not just automatic repetition. Now, let me add this. My guess is, we have guess, conjecture, that the ultimate origin of the type scene probably is in oral folklore.
Right.
There are certain archetypes in it. Well, for example, young man in a foreign land. Okay, that is the future bridegroom encountering the other that will become his bride on unfamiliar turf. The well, okay, sociologically, of course, it was a kind of known institution where the young women of the nubile young women of a town would go out to the well at eventide to draw water. So it's sort of like an ancient Near Eastern singles bar. That's where you find unattached women.
Perhaps a slightly different vibe, one might think, than a
Yes.
singles bar, but the point stands. Okay.
Well, I have to say, in my own lifetime, when I found myself single again in my 30s, I was advised by a woman friend to go to a particular outdoor swimming pool on the Berkeley campus because that's where all the young women are. Because I asked her, where do you meet single women in Berkeley? And after a few days of futile sitting by the poolside, in the company of someone I knew, the most beautiful woman I'd ever laid eyes on showed up in a yellow bikini, and she became the love of my life. So I would think of that as my equivalent of the well.
So your shidduch took place at the Berkeley well, you're saying?
Right. And then the well itself, well, we know from other texts, from the Song of Songs and from Proverbs 5, that the well is very frequently a female sexual symbol. And in Proverbs 5, which not everybody may click into that, the young man is warned to be faithful to his wife, who is again, she's some kind of mayan, some kind of spring, and to drink only those waters and not to drink waters from elsewhere. So it's the same thing.
So it's operating on several levels, it seems. The sort of the general convention, the folklore, the symbol of a well, and it's also its actual place as a social convention, as a meeting place.
Right. So my guess is that this story of meeting a bride at a well probably started in oral storytelling, its archetypal nature, but then it like many things, it was adopted by the writers and turned into a sophisticated literary convention.
Interesting. Before we move to the translation, I suppose one last question on this, which is, you mentioned that you borrowed this term from Homeric studies, from ancient Greek studies. Are there literary qualities or characteristics that render the Hebrew Bible unique in comparison to other literature of the ancient world, such as the ancient Greek literature, the ancient Babylonian or Egyptian literature? Are there conventions that or characteristics that are unique to the Hebrew Bible?
Yeah, I'll just choose two.
Okay.
One is something we've been talking about, which is this highly sophisticated use of repetition with variation.
Okay.
Another thing is maybe readers notice the fact that when anything important is happening in biblical narrative, it switches from narration, which is often drastically summarizing, like you can get 17 years of a figure's life in one sentence.
Right.
It switches from summarizing narration to dialogue. And when you move into dialogue, of course, there is a complete equation between narrating time and narrated time, because the figures are speaking. Now, this is something I've been thinking a lot about recently. The use of dialogue in the Bible, I don't see this anywhere else in ancient literature, is very subtle and very supple. What it amounts to really is the single anticipation in ancient literature of novelistic dialogue. Now, obviously, there are great speeches in Homer, moving speeches.
Often of great length.
Right, exactly, great length. This kind of interchange between two speakers in which the character or the social position, even sometimes the beliefs of each of the interlocutors is manifested in the words they choose. And I think that's unique to the Bible. Well, to take the most obvious example, the very first dialogue between Jacob and Esau, and one of my rules of thumb is that the first words the character speaks are an important characterizing device.
If I'm not mistaken, that's also in the ancient rabbinic tradition as well, somewhere. I think that is a midrashic motif, if I'm not mistaken.
The first words that they speak is when Esau returns from the hunt, not having caught anything, and he says, "Haliteni la na min ha'adom adom hazeh." There are a couple of features that. One is the verb that he uses, haliteni, appears only here in the entire biblical corpus. Okay. It's not a word you're ordinarily supposed to use. Why? Because as a rule, biblical narrative restricts itself to a kind of primary vocabulary. Now, this word in rabbinic Hebrew has to do with feeding animals. It's more common in the rabbinic corpus. So one can surmise, even though it's 1,000 years earlier, that it's likely to be some crude kind of eating word.
Right.
So he's saying something like, let me gulp down, let me cram my maw from this red stuff. And then he can't even think of the word nazid, so this red. Of course, there's also puns on his other name, Edom.
Yes,
now, that has been noticed because it's so obvious. What is not noticed is Jacob's first words when he responds it's also very short. He says, Machleni kayom b'choratcha li. And I very carefully follow the Hebrew word order. I think that's often important. Tell me now your birthright to me. Now look at the order of the words. He begins with the imperative, tell me. No, I'm sorry, it's not tell me, just sell. Then kayom, today, meaning now. And then the very fraught object of the sale, your birthright. And then at the end, me. So it's a calculation. He's a very calculating character, Jacob. He said, first sell me. When? Not next week, not tomorrow, but right now, tell me what? The birthright. Wow. And then the object of the sale, and that's the wow, birthright. And at the end of the syntactic chain, Lee, to me. So it kind of springs like a trap snapping shut. And you see the appetite of Esau and the calculating Jacob.
And that's extraordinary. You're saying you can deduce it from half a dozen words.
Right. Wow. And I think, as brief as that is, I would call that novelistic dialogue.
Absolutely. And you're saying that would be a unique feature, let's say.
Yes, I don't see it anywhere else in ancient literature.
So obviously you produced this new comprehensive translation of the Hebrew Bible. A new translation implies a critique of your predecessors, does it not? It implies the fact that there's something unsatisfactory about those who translated the Bible before you. Could you Please tell us what you found unsatisfactory to the extent that it impelled you to spend years of your life correcting this.
Sure. Now, I'll focus various denominational groups assembled scholarly denominational teams of translators in the second half of the 20th century. The one that of course, Jews are familiar with is the Jewish Publication Society translation, which had some excellent scholars. There are a couple that I was personally acquainted with. And the Protestants did the same thing, and the Catholics did the same thing. And I came over a course of time to conclude that those translations were not just inadequate, but they were wretched. Okay.
Yes, I've noticed that too on many occasions. It's sort of the old rule that a camel is a horse designed by a committee.
Yeah,
That's
right,
sort of, right.
Yeah, it's partly the committee, but also the committee's orientation. That is, first, they wanted to make the Bible accessible to modern readers.
Mhm.
And so they recast the Bible in what they thought was modern language, eliminating repetition. By the way, that's one terrible thing that they did. Well, I'll give you an example from the sexual realm.
Okay.
The modern translators don't know what to do with the simple, dignified, and perfectly understandable three terms in biblical Hebrew for sexual intercourse, which is no. And we all know now that because of the King James Version and because of legal terms like carnal knowledge, we know it. And Abraham knew his wife and she conceived and more like that. And the other two terms are to come into and to lie with. And those all work in English.
Yes.
As the King James translators who were literalists understood, or they made them to work. So you find in the modern translations things like to cohabit with, to have intimate relations with, or
Clumsy.
in a way the worst one was one Protestant translation has Potiphar's wife saying to Joseph, "Make love to me." That sounds not like an ancient Egyptian aristocratic lady, but it sounds like a frustrated wife or mistress in the 21st or the 20th century when it was done. So I think that by trying to, and then there's the matter of syntax. Of course, the 20th century translators all repackaged the syntax because they believe erroneously that modern readers can't follow parataxis, parallel clauses.
Right.
So what happens is that these translations make the Bible sound like it was written the day before yesterday, which seems wrong for something written in Iron Age too. Okay, here's a painful thing for me to say. I mean, painful to those translators. They have a tin ear for English. Maybe this is because of the specialization of knowledge in our era. But see, the King James guys had a good sense of the literary English of their era. Lancelot Andrews, who was the most influential, he was the Bishop of London. I think he was the most influential among the three teams of translators. He was a fine prose stylist because we have his published sermons.
Right.
So, well, I'll give you one tiny example: the JPS translation. Right. the clause that indicates the creation of the heavenly luminaries. Et ha'ma'or ha'gadol lememeshelet hayom v'et ha'ma'or ha'katon lememeshelet halayla v'et ha'kochavim, which I translate the great light for dominion of day and the small light for dominion of night and the stars. And one of the reasons I did that is because it gets the cadence of the Hebrew, which is very important. So what
and the word order as well. You preserved
right.
the word order in Hebrew. Interesting.
Now, what the JPS people did was they said the larger light to dominate the day and the smaller light to dominate the night. Not only does that wreck the cadence, but in fact, this is my a small example of having a tin ear for English. The verb to dominate, you would look for in a sentence like, after the Second World War, the Soviet Union dominated the smaller states of Eastern Europe. It's not what the sun and the moon do to the day and the night.
Right.
So there's some kind of lack of sensitivity to the nuances of meaning of English words, and you find this a kind of melange of different dictions. You know, one sentence will sound like a bureaucratic directive, and the next sentence like the daily newspaper, and so forth.
Right. I mean, well, while of course that is entirely inappropriate in a similar text, and this I suppose is another question for you, because translating the Bible brings difficulty precisely because the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible are so variegated in their genre.
Yes.
And in the writing and the style. I mean, you know, you couldn't find two more different books than, you know, let's say the Book of Kings versus, you know, the Song of Songs versus the Book of Job. I mean, these are as different as night and day. And so, you know, I'm assuming that was a great challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, well, of course, comparing a poetic book to a narrative prose, it's two different genres.
Right.
But even the narrative prose, okay, let's start with the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
We have, I guess, four principal sources, but that's not exhaustive. There's the priestly source, the Yahwistic source, P.J., the Elohistic source, and Deuteronomy.
Right. If I might interrupt you, Professor, just for those listeners of this podcast who are unaware of this, these are the principal sources which academic Bible scholars have identified within the Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, as the principal textual sources from which that book is woven. Right.
Okay. So the difference between J and E stylistically is not big. So I mean, there's certain terms that are native to E and native to J, but there's not a big stylistic difference. The difference between P and those two is quite big, and now the priestly source, of course, devotes a lot of space, as in Leviticus, to you know, cultic procedures, and that doesn't lend a lot of space for a literary translation. But when P is narrating events, he has a kind of choreographed prose that is very balanced and very eloquent, which is, you can see this in the two creation stories at the beginning of Genesis, that actually even that little bit that I quoted from the creation of the sun and the moon, it's cadenced, and it's very balanced. Whereas as soon as you get into J, the second version of creation, it's kind of very dynamic and it lends itself to human interaction. So I tried to represent that. And then when you get to Deuteronomy, your listeners will recall that Deuteronomy is a series of speeches.
Right.
And it's oratorical with long periodic sentences. Some of them run on for 2 or 3 or 4 verses. And I tried to get that difference too.
Right. Interesting. So, I mean, do you try and place yourself in the shoes of the author? I mean, you're going around different texts. You're translating the book of Job, which I'm a big fan of, and a fan, of course, your translation. So, to translate a book like that, does that require you to sort of enter the mindset of who might be penning those, this theological dialogue of this poetry of despair? I mean, did you try and assume the place of that author in your mind while rendering it into English?
To a certain degree. Now, okay, Job, in my mind, is the greatest of all the Hebrew poets.
I quite agree.
One of the great poets in the whole Western literary tradition. I am not one of the great poets of the whole, but so what I imagine I was doing was an act of ventriloquism. That is
Fair enough.
Here's a counterfactual fantasy. If Job were the same poet, but he happened to be living in the 21st century, writing in English, how would his poetry come out? On the whole, pretty happy with my translation of Job. Like I think that the sweep of the voice from the whirlwind, for example, which is astonishing poetry, comes out to a great extent in my translation. Now, there are places where you're stumped. For example, see, the vocabulary, the Hebrew vocabulary of the Job poet is the biggest of any poet in the whole Bible. Where there aren't words, he will grab a word from Aramaic and Hebraize it. So I think he was the first one. In classical Hebrew, classical meaning first temple, the only way you can say word is davar, plural dvarim. And all of a sudden in Job, you find milim, which is a borrowing from the Aramaic. But anyway, I was about to give you an example where the Job poet stumped me. There happened to be 5 different words for lion, Lion, in biblical Hebrew. Evidently, their lions were roaming around the countryside. David, as a young shepherd, had to contend with them. And I assume that they had words for different kinds of lions. A bigger lion, a smaller lion, a lion with a thick mane, and who knows?
A young whelp or something.
Yeah, we will never know. So there is there are, I think it's 2 lines of poetry in Job where he trots out all 5 Hebrew words for lion.
Oh gosh!
What are you going to do when in English there's only 1 word for lion? So you say lion, king of the beasts, and then you're pretty much stuck.
That's but it's eminently forgivable. considering the paucity in this regard of the English vocabulary.
Right.
I'd like to dive in to one small comment you make in the book of Job, because that opens up another question that I want to broach with you, namely the massive influence in the English language of the King James Bible, the King James Version translation of 1611. So this occurs at the beginning of chapter 38, where after 37 chapters, or really 35 chapters of Job calling God out, God finally responds. And he responds, the verse says, he responds to Job, min ha-sa'ara, from within. Now, the King James translation has from within the whirlwind. And you note the following, if you don't mind me reading out your comment, which is the whirlwind. You say, though the Hebrew sa'ara probably means simply storm, this translation choice and the consequent phrase, the voice from the whirlwind, have been so deeply embedded in the imagination of speakers of English after the King James Version that it seems wise not to tamper with it. I thought this was quite an extraordinary comment, because it's a quite extreme example of you acknowledging the enormous influence of the King James Version, which has implanted in the minds of the English speakers certain phrases like "from within the whirlwind," or "Lord is a loving shepherd," or something like that. And these phrases, and you say here, this is an example where you don't want to tamper with the King James Version. So, I mean, I want to ask, how was it writing a biblical translation in a language where, for many intents and purposes, there already is an authoritative translation?
Okay. There are a few points. This is one of them, where a wording from the King James Version has become, I would say, almost proverbial in English.
Right.
Another example, am I my brother's keeper? Now, you really don't need keeper. There are other ways to put it, but I thought it rolls off your tongue as a native speaker of English, and is not inaccurate, so let's stick with it. Now, let me say, so I was cognizant of the King James Version, and the fact that they tend to follow the Hebrew syntax, not always, but usually. This parataxis that I talked about drew me. They did it because basically they figured, well, if God put the words in this order, then we can't mess with that.
Hard to argue with that reasoning,
Yeah, right, exactly. I did it because I thought this is parataxis was the dominant literary vehicle of these writers, and you have to honor that. Very occasionally, by the way, when I translated, I avoided looking at any other translation until I had finished a short section. And then I would glance at a few, and sometimes on the level of a single word, I would say, oh, yeah, that's a better choice than mine. So I don't think that constitutes plagiarism.
No.
A couple of times I discovered that a rendering that I had done of a verse from the Bible kind of rediscovered the King James Version. It was the same thing. It's sort of like there's that wonderful Borges story called the Quixote of Pierre Menard, where a French symbolist poet labors many years to translate, to revise, not translate, to revise Don Quixote. And at the end of his tireless revisions, he comes out with a version that is entirely identical with Cervantes. But then the narrator says, but look at the difference. That is, he's a French symbolist and a poet in the 20th century, and everything that seems the same is not the same. But anyway, I'm going to say a couple of things now against the King James Version.
That's true heresy, but go ahead.
Yeah. The first is that they actually do poetry. Sometimes it's beautiful and eloquent, but they do it less successfully than they do the narrative prose. Because I think maybe it's because they weren't hearing the Hebrew always, but often just deciphering it as Christian Hebraeus from the written text. So in the poetry, they often totally ignore the rhythms, the meter of the Hebrew, and the compactness of the Hebrew. So, for example, there is a line from Job: "Lama lo merechem amut mi betem etzei ve'egva," which is, I think, 6 words in the Hebrew. Which
right. I imagine it's chapter 3 or 4 of Job, but where is that?
I think it's 3. I think it's 3.
Okay.
So I think I translated, "Why did I not die from the womb, from the belly come out and expire?" Oh, okay. The first half of the line is better in the King James Version. "Why died I not from the womb?" It's a better rhythm. I thought that I should not permit myself that syntactic inversion because it sounds a little bit too archaic.
Right.
This is a kind of judgment call. So I said, "Why did I not die from the womb?" instead of "Why died I not from the womb?" That's great.
Yeah.
And you read the second half of the line, and here I'll. This is a loose memory; it's not exact. Why did I not come out from the belly and give up the ghost? Something like that.
Oh gosh.
3 times the number of words and it has no rhythm at all. So there are many instances like that in the King James. Then, of course, there are all kinds of inaccuracies in the King James because the fact of the matter is that the Hebrew of Christian Hebraeus in the 17th century was not bad, all things considered, but it was not great in all cases. And I think that Rashi and Ibn Ezra understood biblical Hebrew better.
Right.
I won't enumerate unless you want me to.
I think that statement stands as almost well, not self-evident, but eminently reasonable to the point of not requiring demonstration.
Yeah. Okay. So now the third thing is that there is a certain Christian bias in the King James Version. Some of it may be perfectly conscious, some of it may not be. Well, for example, ever since the Vulgate, the old Latin translation, nephesh has been translated as soul. It doesn't mean soul in biblical Hebrew. They didn't have a notion of soul. Although nephesh in rabbinic Hebrew does come to mean soul, but that's different. So my favorite example here is the psalm that many English speakers still know by heart, the 23rd Psalm.
Yes. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want."
Right. Okay, the beginning is fine. Then we have Nafshi Yishovev, reviveth my soul, which sounds a little bit like resurrection or life after death.
It does mimic the Hebrew sound, yeshovev, revive.
Yeah,
it has there's something there.
Whereas since nefesh probably simply means life in this context,
Right.
He restores my life by leading me by still waters where I can drink.
Mhm.
Okay, but here's a crucial one. It's a crucial one, but by the way, in which all the modern translations, despite their graduate degrees from Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale in biblical studies, they follow the error of the King James Version. Dishanta b'shemen roshi.
Mhm.
Thou anointest my head with oil. Now, the fact of the matter is that the verb lidashen does not mean to anoint. There is only one Hebrew term that means anoint, and that's limshoach,
Yeah.
cognate with Mashiach. Lidashen, as in deshen in the cultic laws, means something like to make abundant, even to fertilize.
So you have here to moisten. That was your translation choice.
Yeah, I'll tell you. In my first version, I had you pleasure my head with oil, but then my wife blew the whistle on that.
Advisedly so.
That it has a sexual meaning.
Right.
So now to translate it as to anoint implies okay. The verb to anoint in biblical Hebrew is applied to two subjects, to kings being anointed. That was really the equivalent to crowning. If King Charles yesterday had been living in biblical period, instead of putting a crown on him, that they would pour virgin olive oil on his head.
Oh, they did. I don't know if
Oh,
you
they
know, but
did. Oh,
they
I
did.
didn't watch it.
And not only that, the part of the coronation ceremony is oil from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. It is,
Oh
in
boy,
fact, Shemen HaMishcha.
I love that.
Yeah.
So let me see. And the other thing, of course, is consecrating the high priest.
Right.
So, in other words, there are three connotations to mistranslating it as anoint, none of which belongs in the psalm. It's either political, uh, consecrating the king, it's sacerdotal, consecrating the priest, or it's messianic because Mashiach and so forth. So it is seriously misleading, probably in a Christian direction. And then at the end of the 23rd Psalm, it said, Vishavti, which is a truncation of Yashavti, Vishavti bevet Adonai orech yamim.
Right.
And I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the orech yamim doesn't mean forever.
No.
If you say forever, then the house of the Lord becomes the big house up in the sky, where L'orech yamim really means for a long time. Mm-hmm. So what the speaker is saying, in a way, the orientation of the whole psalm, like almost all the psalms, is to here and now.
Right.
So you moisten my head, you rub my head with oil, it feels good. It's like the wayfarer in Homer who arrives at your house and you bathe his feet as you do in the Bible, and you offer him food, and you rub his head with oil because it feels good.
Interesting.
It's been parched in the Mediterranean sun. And at the end, when he says, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for a very long time, what he's saying is, I'd like to hang out in Jerusalem and hear the Levites singing and smell the fragrance of the incense and so forth. So it gives you a whole different picture.
I would say much more earthly and grounded than the picture you get from the King James. Interesting. Yeah, one final question, I suppose. This is a question that I have from several of my friends who are also translation aficionados, who have noticed that in your biblical translation you've preserved the phrase or the beginning of the word with a vav, and. You like the word and you put and in the front of many words, whereas in many other translations they are translated as, also or whereas or something like that, or they are simply elided altogether and just dismissed because they seem to break up the word order too much, or they seem clumsy, let's say, in the English rendition. Whereas yours, which I think you've done overall, obviously, a splendid job of rendering it into very very readable and delightful English. Yet you've chosen to keep and, as far as I can tell, all the time.
Yeah, well, for two reasons. The first is the v in the Hebrew is, it may be a half syllable, but it's part of the rhythm of the text. And actually, in many cases, is va when it's va hipuch. And I think it preserves the sense of a kind of antique formulation.
I see.
Okay, now I want to report an exchange in letters I had with a biblical scholar on this topic.
Please.
I had a friend, he's no longer living, I won't mention his name, who was an eminent biblical scholar, and he was actually my first teacher of biblical text in a Hebrew summer camp many years ago. And he was a wonderful teacher and a smart man. So when my Genesis came out, that was my first stab at translating the Bible, I, of course, sent him a copy. Mm-hmm. And he wrote back, this is before email, he clearly hated it, but he tried to be tactful.
That's most unfortunate.
And he said a few things. He said, I don't know why you use so many ugly words. Oh, by the way, he was on one of those, he was on the JPS committee, okay. I think for Ktuvim. Said, I didn't think I was using ugly words, but I think it had to do with his ear of English and my ear. And he said, and you can't follow the Hebrew syntax and constantly repeat and that way, because English doesn't tolerate it the way Hebrew does, biblical Hebrew. Now, he knew a lot about biblical Hebrew. I don't think he knew a lot about modern literary English, because parataxis is a definite resource in literary prose. You find it in Melville. Of course, you find it in Hemingway, who was influenced by the King James Version. But what I said to him was the following. I said, for my money, the greatest long piece of prose poetry written in the English language in the 20th century is Molly Bloom's soliloquy at the end of James Joyce's Ulysses.
Right.
And it's paratactic from beginning to end with repeated and. So it works for literary English. But my suspicion is, for all my admiration for this particular scholar, he probably never read Joyce's Ulysses. And that's part of the problem, that these translators were not attuned to the possibilities of what you could do in modern English in a literary way.
And I suppose this seems to be what distinguishes your translation from all the others. That it's so not only has a background in Hebrew, but also a significant background in the rhythms and the sheer extent of the arsenal of tools available to the translator.
Let me tell you one additional anecdote on translating parataxis as parataxis. I have a friend who was teaching an undergraduate course at Stanford, in which he included, it wasn't a course on the Bible, but he included, for whatever reason, Ezekiel or part of Ezekiel.
Okay.
And they were using, I don't know, the New English Bible, one of those for Ezekiel. And at that point, my prophets had not come out yet, but he asked me if I had a draft, if I could share it. So I sent, of Ezekiel, so I sent it to him. And then he conducted an experiment with his students. These are about, 19-year-old American kids.
Right.
He asked them to consider the difference between my version of a particular passage and one from the standard translation that we're using. And he sent me their responses, and they all preferred my translation. And they said things like, it conveyed the concreteness of the original text much better. So it's a kind of laboratory illustration of how modern readers actually can read parataxis.
Right. And all I can say is, if you manage to render Ezekiel comprehensible to 19-year-olds, that is a sign your translation is successful. Okay, I think that's an excellent place to stop. Once again, this has been wonderful. I've learned an enormous amount, and I'm sure our listeners will as well. Professor Alter, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast of Jewish Ideas. It has been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you, really.
This has been the podcast of Jewish Ideas by Torah in Motion, produced by Elisha Kelman and myself, JJ Kimchi. Edited and mixed by Elisha Kelman. You can stay up to date by subscribing in your favorite podcast app. To support more thoughtful Jewish content like this, please visit torahinmotion.org/donate.